at 10 o'clock sharp on a Wednesday morning as we zip along with Zoom with the Efrating Eshkolo. And Rabbi Zepp will continue with another session on this topic. Just announce it, please, Rabbi Zepp.
Yeah, the Ibn Ezra, and especially the controversial aspects of the Ibn Ezra. Okay, so
As it
let's
relates
just
to
do.
modern Torah.
Yes, so that's true that there are other controversial aspects of the Ibn Ezra. The truth matter is that it would be worth spending many, many weeks in the Ibn Ezra because he is such a provocative and interesting commentator on the Torah. But we're just focused on a particular aspect, and that is his suggestion that there are, to use an academic term, post-Mosaic additions to the Torah. Okay, so we're trying to understand what's going on there. So let's just do a very quick review. We saw in our discussion that the Mishnah states that all Israel has a place in the world to come. That's the good news. And that's where most people stop with that Mishnah. If they read on, it continues to say, except for, and it lists all these exceptions that if you think certain things, that you lose your place in the world to come. And one of those is someone who denies the notion that Torah mina shamayim, that the Torah is from heaven. So someone who was to suggest, for instance, that Moshe is the author of parts of the Torah, not God or somebody else. Certainly, all the more so if you think that that Arthur wrote part of the Torah, right? So you lose your place in the world to come. Okay, so all well and good, but we also found out that the Talmud itself clarifies this issue. It's a little subtle and nuanced. We saw, for instance, that the Talmud itself suggests that the last 8 verses in the Torah were perhaps written by Yehoshua. Okay, that's a dispute in the Talmud. We also saw that the Talmud seems to 100% agree that the entire Torah was not given at Mount Sinai, but rather the commandments were given at Mount Sinai, as well as the narrative of the Torah from the beginning of the Torah up until that historical point. But the rest of the Torah was given in installments as a function of revelations, which occurred particularly in the first couple of years in the wilderness, and then at the end of the wilderness experience, that there were events that took place, and God then revealed to Moshe how those should be recorded. Yes?
Why should Chazal go ahead and state a punishment that they can't know for sure is in fact the case, based on a lack of an educational level or a spiritual understanding? So it's a mindset. Why go ahead and state something so severe without any knowledge if in fact that's really the case? I mean, it's
Well, I'm not sure what you're asking.
when rabbis say you're losing olam haba by holding a different perspective, that sounds like a real whip in the hand for people who are afraid to state their innermost fears. And it seems like it's overstepping the bounds of what rabbis should be doing. It's threatening
Okay, so
people with their future, their soul. I mean, it sounds like
yeah.
what Christians would do, right?
Okay, so it sounds like you may be asking one of 2 questions, and I'm not sure which one. So let me just tell you the 2 questions I heard, and one of them I can't really answer, and the other one I think I can. So one of your, maybe both of these are your questions. One of them I hear is that you're asking, wait a second, is it so clear what we mean by the phrase Torah mina shamayim? Like, what does that doctrine actually mean, that the Torah, it comes from heaven? Since the Talmud itself suggests that Yehoshua may have written the last 8 verses, right? And the whole thing wasn't given to Mount Sinai, that it was given in serial fashion. So a doctrine that seems to be so clouded in mystery, to use something clouded in mystery and threaten people that if they, sort of like saying, if you don't pay your taxes properly, we're going to put you in jail for 10 years, except for trying to figure out the tax code. Right? It's totally, confusing. You need to have hire professional people to figure out what's legal, what's illegal. So that seems to be one of your questions. we'll answer that question today, Bezrat Hashem. The other question is more of a general statement that I'm not really sure you're asking, and that is that why, let's say even we assumed we knew exactly what the doctrine of Torah from heaven means. It's not fair of the rabbis to, go around making such threatening statements that if you don't abide by this certain doctrine, you lose your place in the world to come. So that also sounds like it might have been your earlier question.
Yeah.
So those are actually two separate questions. The second question, I think perhaps we could say the following, that it's not the rabbis, right? They're recording a tradition that they have that, this is something you should know. It's not not trying to intimidate you. It's trying to help you. We want to maximize your chances of having a place in the world to come. And we have a tradition, the rabbis say, that if you do certain things, you risk losing your place in the world to come. And one of those, we have a tradition, is that if you deny, not die, if you deny your place in the world to come, I would like to know that information. That's in my interest, right? So I don't overstep the bound. So the other point that is sort of implicit in your question, and I don't want to spend too much time on it, is you sort of expressed surprise that Judaism can be doctrinaire. That we have, you'll excuse the expression, but it's appropriate the way you formulated the question, that we have a catechism, a series of beliefs that you're supposed to believe in. We do actually have a series of beliefs. It's not just a bunch of practices that you're supposed to do and you can believe whatever you want to believe. There may be some neighbors of yours in Efrat who think that's true, but it's not true. And it's worth noting that the Rambam, in the beginning of his Mishneh Torah, has Hilchot Yesodei Torah. He wrote a book of law, but in the beginning of that book of law is the laws of opinions, the fundamental philosophical foundations of Judaism, and of course his famous 13 principles of faith. So it's a mistake to think that Judaism is only a bunch of practices without any doctrinaire beliefs. We do have doctrinaire beliefs. Okay, fine. Now, after we established this idea that there's this belief in Torah min hashamayim, and Torah comes from heaven, we then proceeded to note that the Ibn Ezra says something pretty problematic in light of this doctrine. And in his commentary on the beginning, at the beginning of the book of Devarim, where there's an introduction to Moshe's long speeches, and it lists spatial coordinates and time coordinates when these speeches took place. So the Ibn Ezra on that says, well, concerning this passage, which lists the spatial coordinates and time coordinates, and if you'll understand the secret of the 12, and if you'll understand what it means that Moshe wrote, and if you'll understand the verse which says, and the Canaanite was in the land, and if you'll understand the verse which says, on the mountain the Lord was seen, and if you'll understand the reference to Og being a very big guy, so big that the Torah says that his bed, which was this bed of iron, and it was huge, right? If you'll understand all of those verses, Takir Hamet, you will know the truth. So we've taken upon ourselves the task of trying to understand all those references so that we can know the truth. That's what Ibn Ezra says. If these are actually 6 passages he's referring to in the Torah, 6 passages, and we're going to go through all 6. We started that last week, and we're going to, Bezrat Hashem, finish it this week. So the first passage we saw was the secret of the 12, and we pointed out last week that that's apparently a reference to the last 12 verses of the Torah. Wow, the Talmud has an opinion that says the last 8 verses of the Torah were written by Yehoshua. Ibn Ezra expands that to the last 12 because the last 12 are already describing Moshe leaving the camp and going up to this mountain where he's going to die. So why limit the assumption that Moshe probably didn't write verses describing his own death and say Yehoshua perhaps wrote those verses? Well, let's just use that same principle. It makes sense to describe the entire chapter. The entire chapter describes the preparation for his death. So instead of 8, it's 12. Okay. Makes a lot of sense. Furthermore, the Ibn Ezra says that in those 12 verses, one of those verses, the 6th verse of the 12 verses, says that nobody knows where the place of his grave is until this very day. So the Ibn Ezra just points out, until this very day sort of implies, a long distance from when the event took place. Till this very day, nobody knows where the grave is. So it certainly doesn't sound like Moshe writing that, right? And as a matter of fact, it doesn't even make so much sense to say Yehoshua wrote that right after the death of Moshe, which is the way the Talmud seems to present it. Because until this very day implies a long passage of time. So we saw that the Talmud says maybe it means that Yehoshua added that to the Torah at the very end of his life. So, right, then there's more distance. It would make more sense to say, wow, until this very day, we still don't know where the burial place of Moshe is. Okay, we saw another example that among the six that the Ibn Ezra cited, and that is in the book of Devarim, in the 31st chapter, it says that Moshe wrote this Torah and he gave it to the Kohanim, who are descendants of Levi, who bear the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and to all the elders of Israel. That's a verse in the 31st chapter, verse 9. By the way, if you're following along the sources, that's source number 18. This is just a review, so I'm going quickly. At that point, we were introduced to the Tzafnat Paneach. Tzafnat Paneach is one of the most famous and useful super commentaries on the Ibn Ezra, because the Ibn Ezra refers to this verse as being one of the secret, mysterious verses in his commentary in the very beginning of the book of Devarim, Deuteronomy. But on the verse itself, the Ibn Ezra doesn't comment, interestingly enough. So in order to unpack what the Ibn Ezra may have been thinking, we had to use a super commentary. So that super commentary was Tzafnat Paneach, written in the 14th century by this scholar, Rabbi Yosef ben Eliezer. And he wrote it to defend the honor of the Ibn Ezra. The Ibn Ezra was subjected to brutal criticism already in the Middle Ages, not just hundreds of years later.
Well, based on what you said, people could accuse him of losing Olam Haba.
They certainly could have, right? And they accused him of other things because he says other things that are controversial. He seems to treat midrashim. Like Rashi often quotes midrashim to explain the meaning of the Torah. Ibn Ezra has a very problematic attitude towards midrashim. Okay, so he gets into hot water for a lot of reasons. Also, his Hebrew is hard to understand. He hardly has any words. Hey, he was an expert in Hebrew. It's not that he didn't know Hebrew. He was a great poet, Hebrew poet. But he hardly uses any words. He sometimes still commentary is one word, Ibn Ezra. So this particular scholar, Rabbi Yosef ben Eliezer, came to the defense of the Ibn Ezra, and he wrote a commentary on the Ibn Ezra. I just want to point out something interesting. I don't think I said last week that this commentary was only finished at the urging of a great-great-grandson of the Rambam. It was a descendant of the Rambam. The Rambam was so respected that his sons and grandsons and great-grandsons had like official, they were called a Nagid, like the leader of the community, like the president of the shul. They had this very respected, and the Nagid who lived in his time in the 14th century said, "Oh, you must finish that commentary, and I'll support you. You got to come to Yerushalayim and finish it because it's very important." And you can sort of imagine someone who follows the kind of the rational approach of the Rambam may be very supportive of the Ibn Ezra, and therefore wanted to have a book written to explain the intention of Ibn Ezra. In any case, what was the mystery behind this verse? And Moshe wrote this Torah, and he gave it to the Kohanim, as we explained last week. The Tzafnat Paneach explains that verse implies it's only in the 31st chapter of Devarim. There's a whole bunch of Devarim after that. Right? That's not the end of the book of Devarim. So that verse that says Moshe wrote the Torah and he gave it to the Kohanim, that implies that somebody is describing Moshe having already finished the entire Torah and then giving it to the Kohanim. How could Moshe have written that verse? It seems like it's somebody else, right? So we don't know who that somebody else is, but it's not Moshe. That seems to be the secret of that verse, according to Ibn Ezra. Okay, we saw another example of this which is the reference already in the book of Breshit, in the book of Genesis, where it describes the Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac. And there it makes a reference to the fact that the place where Isaac was bound and was to be sacrificed is going to be the place of the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple, Har HaMoriah, the place where God appears, Har HaMoriah. How could Moshe refer to that place, Har HaMoriah? In Moshe's lifetime, God never told him where the Beit HaMikdash was to be built. God said the place I'll choose. Never says Har HaMoriah. Moshe didn't know that. So how come in the Akedat Yitzchak it says V'har Shem Yira'eh, which means Har HaMoriah? Right? That verse was a later addition, not from the time of Moshe. Okay, so the last example, or the next last example we saw, was this reference to that in the National Museum of Rabat Bnei Ammon, that the Torah says there that you want to know how big Og was? Well, his bed is there in the museum. Moshe never was there, but Israel was never there in Rabat Bnei Ammon until much later in Jewish history. How did they know that in the National Museum there's his bed there, and that would give you an example of how big Og was? That must have been put there later. As a matter of fact, the Tzafnat Paneach says it must have been one of the Nivim Ha'achronim, one of the last prophets. So according to the Tzafnat Paneach's understanding of Ibn Ezra, we have verses that are coming from the very end of the period of the prophets that were inserted into the Torah. And that's how the Tzafnat Paneach explains the Ibn Ezra. Okay? The next and final passage that we saw last week, which we're going to continue with now, is the place we started, and that is that when the Torah describes in the book of Breshit, in the 12th chapter, the Torah says that Avram entered into the land, right? He left his birthplace, he entered the land, and the Torah, and he's wandering around. He came to Shechem, to Elon Moreh, and then the Torah says, V'kanani az ba'aretz, and the Canaanite was then in the land. That's another example that the Ibn Ezra says is part of this great sod, this great secret. So the Ibn Ezra explains that the two possible ways of understanding it. Then could mean that they weren't there before, but then they were there, right? That the Shemites, the descendants of Shem, were there before. This is how Rashi explains it. Ibn Ezra explains, first like Rashi, that the Canaanite was then in the land. They hadn't been there before. The descendants of Shem had been there before, but then the Canaanites were conquering the land. And so in Abraham's time, they were in the process of conquering the land. So nothing controversial about that. But then the Ibn Ezra says, and if you don't say it that way, then there's a big secret here. And a smart person will understand it and shut up. V'hamaskil yavin v'yidom. An intelligent person, yavin, will understand, v'yidom, but be quiet. Shut up. Don't say anything. Well, what's that big mystery? So now we're moving on. Okay, so to the new material. That was a quick review. So you look in source number 27. Source number 27. Now this is a very long analysis from the Tzafnat Paneach explaining the approach of the Ibn Ezra. He's going to deal now with all of the theological problems, and he's going to answer all of Bruce's problems. Bruce will be able to sleep tonight for the first time in several years, because all of his theological problems will be resolved. Okay. So I'm going to skip just a little bit. The Tzafnat Paneach first explains the Ibn Ezra's first approach, that when it says the Canaanite was then in the land, it doesn't mean then but not now, right? Because that's impossible. Because Moshe, in Moshe's lifetime, the Canaanite was in the land. So if Moshe wrote the Torah, then can't mean then but not now. But it's like Rashi explains, right? It means then but not beforehand. Okay. So now we're going to go on in the Tzafnat Paneach. This is really fascinating. It begins just 4 lines into source number 27, where it says, he quotes the Ibn Ezra, B'im eineno kain, if it's not true, like I just said, that the Canaanite was then in the land, means then but not beforehand, rather than then but not now. So if that's not the case, that it means then but not beforehand, well then yesh lo sod, this is a secret. Mamaskil yidom. Then the intelligent person will understand it and shut up. What did the Ibn Ezra mean by that? So here's the Safna Paneach, Perush. Im lo ba milat az lo diesha az tafsa miyad acher. If you don't want to interpret it like Rashi and the first interpretation of the Ibn Ezra, then it means then but not beforehand, because the Canaanite had been capturing the land from the descendants of Shem. Ya perush kashev satum b'rui lalimo. Then the interpretation is a mystery, and it's fit to hide it. So explains Sapna Paneach, that if you don't interpret it like Rashi does, I'm saying Rashi anachronistically because Rashi, Rashi actually already wrote his commentary at this time. So, but if you don't explain it like Rashi, so Ra'ui Lahalimo, it's fit to hide it. V'hu remes sodo, and this is an allusion to the great secret, where the Ibn Ezra says, if you'll understand the following 6 passages, you'll see a great secret, and then you'll understand the truth. It's part of that series of great secrets. Uperusho, ki eich amar bekan milataz. How could it say then but not now? Shemashma'a az haya ba, avalata eno kain. Right? The word then means then but not now. Hello, Moshe katabat Torah. Wait a second, Moshe wrote the Torah. Ubiyamav haita haaretz biyada Kanani, and in his days the Canaanite was in the land. Right? The Canaanite was in the land. So how could it be then but not now if Moshe wrote the Torah? V'lo yitachen sheyomar Moshe az. It's impossible that Moshe wrote the word then. Because the word then means a time when the Canaanite is not in the land. That can't be Moshe's time. We know that the Canaanites were in fact in the land until way after the death of Moshe, when Yehoshua started to conquer the land. It must be that Moshe didn't write this passage. Moshe did not write this passage. Rak Yehoshua, maybe Yehoshua wrote it. Or maybe some other prophet wrote it. You realize how wide the Safna Paneach is now in interpreting the Ibn Ezra. It's just not Yehoshua writing last day Psukim. It's other verses too. And it's not necessarily Yehoshua right after the death of Moshe. It could be Yehoshua at the end of his life, like we saw before. Or it could be some other Navi, even at the end of the prophetic period. Wow. Now he says, I'll show you in Tanakh that there's a precedence for this idea of later editions. Watch this. Kashir Matana B'Sefer Mishlei. We're going to look in the book of Mishlei, Proverbs. Now, he's not right now trying to prove that it's theologically kosher to have later additions to the Torah. He's just showing from a literary point of view that sometimes you can have a work which is 98.6% from the original author, but there can be later additions. Okay? He's not dealing with the theological problematics right now. Just with the literary point, he can have a work, but has later additions. And in this case, it's explicit. The book of Proverbs. Now, according to Jewish tradition, who wrote the book of Proverbs? King
Solomon,
the wisest of all men. But I don't know if you ever noticed this before. Let's skip to the 25th chapter of the book of Proverbs. It says the following. Gam Eila Mishlei Shlomo. And the following are also the Proverbs of King Solomon. Asher he'etiku anshe Chizkiah melech Yehuda, that the men of Chizkiah, Hezekiah, the king of Yehuda, copied. So what does that mean? There's the original book of Proverbs. And then Chizkiah, he is not a contemporary of King Solomon. He and his scribes, they added to the book of Proverbs. Look how the Safna Paneach explains this. Ki achar sheshlomo chiber hasefer lamanis karsham chizkiah shelonad achar kamadorot. Wait a second. If you say that King Solomon wrote the book of Proverbs, how come Chizkiah is mentioned there, who was several generations after King Solomon? Obviously, the book of Proverbs is not a literary whole coming from the pen of King Solomon. Rak haya zo kabbalah biyadam. It's that there was a tradition in the hands of this later generations, ish mipi ish, a tradition had been handed down from each generation, person to person, mipi Shlomo, going all the way back to Shlomo. And they wrote it, and it's considered as if Shlomo wrote it, but he didn't write it. It was recorded much later, but it was handed down orally and then put into the book of Mishlei. So he's just pointing again, we're not dealing with theological issues right now, just from a literary point of view, the notion that there is a biblical work that was written by X, but there were later additions to it. We have an explicit example of that. V'kacha b'chan, so too in the Torah itself, he's saying, Haya Kabbalah b'dei Yisrael. There was a Kabbalah. There was a received tradition in the hands of the Jewish people. Should be May Avraham Haya Knani Baretz, that in the days of Abraham, the Canaanite was in the land, in Eretz Yisrael. V'katavoto echad min neviim kan, and one of the prophets put it into the Torah. So when it says, and the Canaanite was then in the land, it really does mean then, but not now. But Moshe couldn't have written that because the Canaanite was in the land in Moshe's time. So what happened? Many generations later, there was a tradition passed down that in those days, the present-day archaeologists have discovered the Canaanite was then in the land, right? It was a tradition, the way he puts it. It was tradition. And somebody inserted that into the Torah, thinking that that would help elucidate the meaning of that passage, of that episode in the Torah. Okay, now, so far, he has just made, remember, this is not the Ibn Ezra talking. It's the Safna Paneach explaining the Ibn Ezra. So it's important to bear in mind. Because you could argue.
Is this an opening for those who want to say that there's multiple authors of the Torah? They can use this as
we're gonna discuss that explicitly. We're going to discuss what happened in later generations with the Ibn Ezra, or how he was used in a way which we'll see if it was fair or not. Okay, but I just want to point out right now that this explanation is from the Tzafna Paneach, but I mean it's a very reasonable explanation of the Ibn Ezra. But the Ibn Ezra didn't say these words. This is from Tzafna Paneach.
Was there a backlash against this?
Yeah, and we'll see that too. Okay, now we have not dealt with the theological problems, and only he's just interpreting the words of the Ibn Ezra, and he's pointing out that there is a precedent for the idea of a literary work that has later editions, right? Like in Proverbs, Book of Proverbs. Okay, that's also the plainest way of understanding those verses, right? And the Canaanite was then in the land. Most naturalistic way of interpreting that verse is then, but not now. Fine. Now, before Bruce loses his place in the world to come, we're going to deal with the theological issues. Look what he says. He knows you're getting upset. He knows that all of the pious Jews in Efrat, whose religious sensitivities are horrified at this point, want to know, how could he have said these things? So now he explains. V'achar sheyesh lanu la'amin b'divrei Kabbalah. Safna Paneach says, since we believe in the words of tradition, u'b'divrei nevuah, and we believe in prophecy, We have traditions. We believe them to be true. We have prophecy. We believe in prophecy. Mali shekatavo Moshe o shekatavo Navi acher. Why should I care whether Moshe wrote it or some other prophet wrote it? Ho'il v'divrei kulam emet. Since whether Moshe wrote it or a different prophet much later in history wrote it, their words are true. Their words are prophecy. Okay, so this is his big principle in theologically justifying post-Mosaic additions to the Torah. If you say that Arthur put in those words in the Torah, well, that would be a severe problem unless you assume Arthur is a prophet. And I dearly love him, but I think he would be the first to tell you that he's not a prophet. But Yehoshua, the Gemara itself suggests that Yehoshua wrote the last 8 psukim. According to Bruce, why doesn't that opinion in the Talmud that says Yehoshua wrote the last psukim, whoever said that, why didn't that rabbi lose his place in the world to come? He's denying Mosaic authorship. So along comes the Safneach and says, what are you getting so excited about? The Mishnah had said somebody who denies Torah, Hashamayim, someone who denies not Mosaic authorship, but the Torah is from heaven. To put in simpler language, what does Torah from heaven mean? Someone who denied that the Torah is a product of revelation loses their place in the world to come. Revelation. So the Safmat Paneach says the Ibn Ezra is safe. And also that opinion in the Talmud is safe that says last 8 psukim written by Yehoshua. No problem. Because they were written by a prophet. Yehoshua, or a later prophet, and then inserted in the Torah. So that is still in the category of Torah min hashamayim. Okay. Any problems with this? Are we all good?
I thought that more than just the words, every word up and letter, which of course is the traditional view, that bigger than that would be every mitzvah and every do's and don'ts of mitzvot, that was given, and that's not made up by anyone later on. But all these other issues of stories and like sidebar stuff, maybe another prophet included it or otherwise. But the main thing was the mitzvot, all the do's and don'ts, the 613.
Okay, so you actually just anticipated the next part of our discussion. If you'll notice, the Ibn Ezra listed 6 examples of post-Mosaic additions. Now, when I say 6 examples, I want to be careful. When the Ibn Ezra says, if you'll understand the following 6 cases, you'll know the truth, but you should be quiet about it. So does he mean these are the 6 post-Mosaic additions to the Torah? Or does he mean these are samples, but there may be more? Let's be very conservative right now with a small c. And let's assume that from the Ibn Ezra's perspective, there are 6. That's it. Well, let's quickly review the 6. Number 1 was the spatial coordinates of where Moshe's speech took place at the end of in Dvarim, in the book of Deuteronomy. Story, no mitzvot there. Example was number 2, the last 12 verses of the Torah, no mitzvot there. The third was what describing Moshe writing the Torah and giving it to the prophets. I'm sorry, giving it to the Zikanim, the elders, right? Giving it to the Kohanim. Sorry about that. Giving it to the Kohanim. No mitzvot described there. The Canaanite was then in the land, we just discussed. No mitzvot there. The reference to Har HaMoriah, the place where the binding of Isaac took place. The household place of the Beit HaMikdash. No mitzvot there. The size of the bed of oak, right? That's in the National Museum. And Ramat Bnei Ammon, no mitzvot there. Okay, so Bruce is noticing something. We're only talking about stories, no mitzvot. And you're going to see how that is a very important point. Okay, so just hang on to that thought. Okay, now let's go back into the Safnat Paneach. So now he asks a very interesting question. V'im Tomar, and if you'll say, we're at source number 27, towards about halfway through it. If you'll say, Hinei katuv lo tosif alav, it says in the book of Dvarim, you shall not add to the Torah. Whoa, whoa, whoa. So we solved the problem of that the Torah is from Revelation. Yeah, no problem. It just, why does it have to be revealed by Moshe or to Moshe? It could have been revealed to other prophets. Okay, we solved that. Except for the Torah says, don't add to me. What do you do about that? So he's going to try to struggle with that problem. Another theological halachic problem. Hatshuva, here's the answer. The Safnat Paneach says, Da, you should know. Ki Rabbi Avraham batzmo pirei zo b'parshat V'etchanan. The Ibn Ezra itself already has anticipated that problem. How post-Mosaic additions don't infringe upon the prohibition of additions. This is a problem. It says don't add, and he's saying additions were made. So the Ibn Ezra already solved that problem. How so? Because the Ibn Ezra has this principle that he said in several places, which I'm not sure I myself understand. He says the following. This is the language of the Ibn Ezra. The words of the Torah are like a body, but the meaning is the soul. It's a principle in interpreting the Torah. The words of the body, meanings of the soul. What does that mean? Apparently it means the following. Now, this is another reason why the Ibn Ezra got into trouble. If you take a look at the Talmud, every nuance of language in the Torah is highly significant. So, for instance, if the Torah repeats a mitzvah more than once, you could say it's because the Torah wants to emphasize it. For instance, the Torah says, Al tifashel gedi b'chalev imo. Don't cook a kid in his mother's milk. That verse appears 3 times in the Torah. Now, what do you do about that? The normative way of understanding the Torah is there is not an extra letter in the Torah. There's not an extra word, and there's certainly not an extra verse. So why does it say the same thing 3 times? So the Talmud discusses that, and based upon the premises of the Talmud, there's nothing extra in the Torah. Everything is meaningful. It appears once to tell you not to eat a cheeseburger. It appears another time to tell you not to benefit from a cheeseburger. So if you had cheeseburger shampoo, a lot of people like these fancy shampoos with special smells. So if you can have a cheeseburger shampoo. Okay, so you're not eating it, but you're benefiting from it. Okay, or let's say you want to go into the business of selling cheeseburgers. Can't do that. That's the second time. The third time, you're not allowed to cook meat and milk together, even if you don't eat it or benefit from it. That's why 3 times. The Ibn Ezra, against the entire Talmudic tradition, says it's just there for emphasis. Or, for instance, when the Torah will say something like, which it often does, mot yumat, dying he shall die, or karot yikaret, cutting he shall be cut off. I'm translating it literally. Now, if you take a look at whenever that phrase appears, we're taking the Hebrew root, one time in the infinitive and one time in the regular form, like mot yumat, dying he shall die. The Talmud always interprets that double language there as not only die in this world, will die in the world to come, or something along those lines. The Ibn Ezra says it just means emphasis. Don't sweat the words. The words are like the body. It's not that important. The meaning is important. So what's the Safna Paneach saying? The fact that we have post-Mosaic additions, as long as they don't change the meaning of the Torah, then it's kosher. Don't sweat the extra words. Extra words aren't that significant. When the Torah says don't add to the Torah, it means don't change the meaning of the Torah. Don't live with the times. We're going to have to update the Torah. Take out a couple of prohibitions which aren't too popular nowadays, right? No, don't change the meaning. That's what the Torah means. These post-Mosaic additions are not changing the meaning, so it's not a problem. Words are like the body. The important thing is the spirit, the meaning. That's his first explanation. I don't know what you think of that. That's his first explanation. Now he goes on.
So how would the Ibn Ezra deal with Sarah ben Mora or the rebellious elder or things that we don't like, and the Talmud itself explains them completely out of the Pshat?
Okay, so here's where the Ibn Ezra is ultra confusing. In the beginning of his commentary, he says there are 5 categories of ways to comment on the Torah. He lists 5 ways. We're not going to go over them right now, maybe in another class. It actually would be a really interesting class. I don't know if this has ever been done for the Efrat Kollel, to go through like the most major commentators on the Torah and talk a little bit about their lives and their kind of methodology in explaining the Torah. That would be a really interesting class. In any case, the Ibn Ezra says there's like 5 ways of commenting on the Torah. He rejects them all except for the 5th, which is himself. And he says that his approach is, when it comes to verses which are narrative verses, telling stories, so you explain them in the simplest, most natural way, based upon the language. But when it comes to mitzvot, we're Orthodox Jews, and we have to accept the Talmudic interpretation of those verses. We're Orthodox, right? So the only problem is the Ibn Ezra, in his actual commentary, doesn't live up to that. And he seems to interpret verses that are even mitzvot, that are, in fact, not the way that the Talmud interprets them. So without going into those specific examples you gave, Bruce, he does seem to say problematic things. You don't have it on your source sheet. I actually was going to share this with you next week, but just because you raised it, let me just see if I can pull this up real quick here. Hang on my handy dandy computer here. Let's see here. I'm going to share with you something. The great 16th century Talmudic commentator and codifier, the Maharshal, Rabbi Shlomo Luria, wrote a book called Yam Shel Shlomo, Commentary in the Talmud. So listen to what he says about the Ibn Ezra. I think I have it here. He says, Ibn Ezra, was no Talmudist. This is an important work I'm reading here. It's not like some fly-by-night rabbi. This is Rabbi Shlomo Luria, one of the most important commentaries on the Torah, Yam Shel Shlomo, on the Talmud. He was no Talmudist. The major portion of his work, including his commentary on the Bible, talks about astronomy, natural sciences, and other secular subjects, like what's that have to do with the Torah? And he dared contradict the biblical scholars in the Talmud. Out of ignorance, he ascribes biblical laws to being rabbinic laws. He countenanced the forbidden and prohibited sanctions. He says that which is forbidden is really permitted, and that which is permitted is really forbidden. His interpretations are not to be followed in matters of law. For in his legal opinions, he often overruled the decisions of the sages of the Mishnah and the Gemara. He boasted that his independent rational faculty would alone guide him interpreting the Bible, and that he would not accept the commentaries of others. his work may be best judged by those who follow him, the heretics and the Sadducees. Okay, so now, so I'm just pointing out that he's controversial for other reasons too, as we just see there, and perhaps we'll discuss that more next week. Okay, so now we're dealing with the specific issue of how could he countenance post-Mosaic addition. The Torah says don't add. So his first explanation was, since they don't change the meaning, so no sweat. The prohibition adding Torah means to not change the meaning. But now he gives a different explanation. And this is Bruce, where you were correct. The Ibn Ezra explains that when it says don't add, it only refers to commandments. Commandments. Don't add commandments. Klomar, mashi hisira Torah lo tosif alav. That which the Torah commands, don't add to it. Lo hizira ki'im al mispar mitzvot al kiram. That's referring to the enumeration of the commandments and their reasons. Of lo al hamilot. It doesn't mean you can't add words. No problem adding words. Al keni mosif navi milal milot davar. Therefore, if a later prophet adds a word or a few words to explain something, kasher shama mipi kabbalah, an interpretation that prophet received through tradition, ein zol tosefet. That's not an addition to the Torah. No problem. Okay. Now he gives a very interesting example of this to prove that it's kosher to add to the Torah. See what you think of his proof here. V'haraya minas hakenim shetirgemu haTorah b'lashon Yevani. The proof is there is an official version of the Torah. It's written in Greek. The famous Septuagint, Targum Oshivim. These were great rabbis who wrote that Torah. Now, why is that a proof? So, he says the following. That in the Talmud, there are enumerated 13 things that the Septuagint, this Jewish translation of the Torah, this Greek translate into Greek, differs from the Torah. It's explained in the Talmud, Masechet Megillah. How are they allowed to put things in there that are not there? What gave them sanction to be able to do that? Vim Tamar Echlifa V'lo Husifu. Maybe you'll say, they translated. It's like saying, instead of saying Vayomer Hashem and Vayomer Hashem, those two Hebrew words you say, and God said. It's not adding to the Torah. It's just, you're just saying the same thing in a different language. That's not a problem. It's just not true. There's a verse in the Torah that says that Moshe put his family on donkeys to schlep them. Shetirgamu al nisadam. The Septuagint doesn't say he put them on a donkey. It says he put them on a people mover. That's what it says in Greek. That's not a translation. It says people mover, not donkey. Also, in the list of non-kosher animals in the Torah, it says a bunny. In the Greek translation, it doesn't say bunny. It says short-legged creature. It's not just a translation. There is a Greek word for bunny. I don't know what it is, but there's a word. They changed it to some kind of explanatory thing. Short-legged creature. So how did they have the permission to do it? You know why? Because it's okay to change the Torah if you're just explaining. That's what he claims. And that's a precedent. And then he says, and I'll just summarize, that, well, okay, maybe they didn't really have justification to do it. But there's a problem. There's the king of Egypt, Ptolemy, who commanded them to do this. So It wasn't okay, but their life was threatened, so they had to do it anyway. So he answers that, in fact, that's not really true, because you're supposed to give up your life, he says, rather than change the Torah. So these rabbis apparently had permission to change the Torah, because it would have just been because of the fear of the king. For that kind of thing, you have to give your life and not do. Okay. So now he says, we're going to the next paragraph. Since you see that these rabbis weren't worried about changing the Torah, as long as they preserve the meaning, they're just explaining. So you see that must be kosher. All the more so, that a prophet has the permission to add to the Torah, as long as he's just explaining. If those rabbis could do it, they're just rabbis. They're not prophets. All the more so, prophets can do something similar. And all the more so, they're not talking about changing mitzvot, like Bruce mentioned before, just narrative parts. And therefore, it's not called an addition. Okay, fine. Now, I'll just tell you my personal opinion. It's just a personal remark. I'm not really sure what his whole proof is from the Targum Shuvim. This Septuagint, it was not. No one claimed that that's here. Here's a Torah scroll. The Septuagint. It was a translation. That's a different story altogether, right? But we're dealing with our holy Torah that has verses in it in Hebrew, and we're claiming that words were inserted after Moshe, even by much later prophets. I don't know how you can compare that to the Septuagint, which is obviously something different than the Torah. Okay, so that's just a question I have on the Safnat Paneach. Okay, we're going to finish this off in the next couple minutes. This is a great achievement, going through all these examples for the Ibn Ezra with the Safnat Paneach. Vim Tomar. Now he deals with, what about the halacha that says, if you say that the entire Torah comes from heaven, except for one verse that God didn't say, but Moshe said it by himself, then concerning that type of person, it says in the book of Bamidbar, Ki Davar Hashem Bazah, he has scorned and despised the word of God. What do you do about that? Aren't we saying that there are 6 examples where God didn't say those? He says, you can answer this. That's talking about mitzvot. It's talking about mitzvot, right? That you're not allowed to say that somebody else added them, not Moshe, right? Not God, right? But we're talking about stories, right? Truth of the matter is, I don't even know what's bothering, because you already explained it, that it's from prophecy, right? All these additions are based on prophecy. They're not saying that God didn't say it. God did say it through prophecy. Okay. Now, he then gives another proof that this is kosher. He says, why do I have to explain all this? The Talmud itself already admits that there could be post-Mosaic additions. Watch this. This is a really fascinating proof. This is in Masechet Makot. It says the following. There's a verse in the book of Yehoshua. It says, "Vayichtov Yehoshua et devarim ha'ela b'sefer Torah Elokim." Yehoshua wrote these words. This book of Yehoshua. Yehoshua wrote these words, b'sefer Torah Elokim, in the book of the Torah of God. Wait a second. Just think about those words. Says there, and Yehoshua wrote these words in the book of the Torah of God. Yehoshua wrote these words into the book of the Torah of God. So there's a dispute in the Talmud. What words? One opinion says the last 8 verses of the Torah. And another verse says it's the passage dealing with the cities of refuge. The Southern Bank says it's explicit. Already the Gemara saying they're post-Mosaic editions, and not just the last 8 psukim, according to another opinion, the passage of the Torah dealing with the mitzvah of the cities of refuge for people who killed accidentally, that Yoshua wrote them and put it into the Torah. So why does Ibn Ezra have to be worried about his place in the world to come? Not a problem. We already have a precedent in the Talmud for this idea. Okay, now we're left with one problem. If it's so kosher, it's so reasonable, right? The Talmud already does it, according to his explanation. The rabbis of the Septuagint, they did it. We're saying it comes from God. It's just a later prophet. We're not changing a mitzvah. We're just adding a couple of explanatory notes about narratives. No problem theologically, halachically, everything is kosher. Why was the Ibn Ezra so cryptic? This is a secret. Don't tell anybody. And the person who understands should shut up. Why be so cryptic? So that's his last comment here. With that, we'll finish for this week. Gam Borvaro Mot. So he says the following. So why do you have to be so secret? V'zeh hasod en ra'ui lahodia livnei adam. This secret you shouldn't tell anybody else. Why? Shelo yalzalzelu b'Torah. They shouldn't treat the Torah in a disrespectful fashion. Why would anybody treat the Torah in a disrespectful fashion if they knew the secret that we just found out about post-Mosaic editions? Ki mi she'einenu maskil, because if you're not smart, v'lo yeda la'afrish bein ha'psukim shenichtavu b'hem mitzvot, and you can't make the distinction with Bruce made, where we make a distinction between narrative material and commandments. Ubein ha'psukim shenichtav b'hem sipurei devarim. If you're not smart enough to make that distinction and people aren't, then they'll just say that, oh my gosh, I thought the Torah was holy. I thought it came from God given to Moshe. And now all of a sudden, no. The Torah is a product of later generations and of all kinds of different people. It ain't what I thought it was. I think I'll go out and eat a cheeseburger. Not everybody's as smart as Bruce. Not everybody can make this distinction between explanatory short passages on the one hand versus changing the Torah. Okay. Furthermore, let me say, because we're running out of time here. There's another reason why Ibn Ezra says, shut up, don't tell anybody this, because of the non-Jews. Shomrim lanu toratchem haytamet, because there are non-Jews who say, your Torah used to be true. Rak echlaftem otah, but you changed it. You know who says that? Muslims. Ibn Ezra is very familiar with Islamic culture. The Muslims claim there was something called the Torah, but it's not what we have now. If the Ibn Ezra were to tell the whole world that, you're right, the Torah as we have it is not the Torah was given to Moshe, they're post-Mosaic editions, the Muslims would say, we told you so. We've been right all along. The Torah as you guys have it is not the Torah that Moshe had. Okay? That's why the Ibn Ezra said, shut up. Right? Because it could be misinterpreted to support the Islamic notion that there was an original Torah, but it's not what we have now. Okay, so we'll stop here now. We have seen all these 6 controversial passages and how the Ibn Ezra interprets them and how the Ibn Ezra was interpreted when he doesn't explain it fully by the Safnat Paneach. We're going to spend at least one more session on this issue to discuss sort of the historical legacy of the Ibn Ezra. Like what happened after this? And what kind of theories developed that presumably were basing themselves upon the Ibn Ezra. And finally, Bezrat Hashem will end up with a very interesting couple of passages from Rav Kook and how he navigates this issue. And with that, I leave you.
Just a quick question. Maybe you can deal with it next week. if we can say that there's Yibum and Chalitza in the Torah, but Chazal decided that Yibum is not best to apply to Ludu Chalitza, then what's wrong with saying, there was an eye for an eye? We used to do that. But, that doesn't really work so well in our day. So we're going to have monetary compensation today.
Yeah. So there's a difference between misinterpreting the Torah or reinterpreting the Torah and using established halachic principles to say this mitzvah doesn't apply in today's circumstances because of whatever reason.
But didn't the
Right?
rabbis
Or
do that with Yibum and Chalitza?
they don't reinterpret the mitzvah itself. They just say that we have several reasons. Look, the Torah says blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, but if it falls on Shabbos, we don't do it. That's a pretty radical thing, but that's based upon established halachic principles.
Uh-huh.
So maybe perhaps we'll discuss this more at a later time. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you. See you next week.